today's brand bag lunch. My name is Isabel, and I'm the curator here at the Amelia Island Museum of History. Before we begin, I'd like to kindly remind everyone to set your phones to silent mode out of respect for our guest speaker and fellow visitors. Thank you. I also would like to share with you our exciting upcoming events here at the museum. Our next third program will be on Friday, October 18th, featuring performer, presenter, and storyteller Diane Ford Holt Johnson. She will bring to life the story of Harriet Tubman, woven into the fabric of American history through captivating stories and slave songs. So that's October 18th. Our next Brand Bag Lunch will continue its journey through the timeline of history. After the Civil War and Reconstruction, we will step into the turn of the century with Kathleen O'Dea, who will be covering the history of women's voting rights in Florida.
What's the day on that?
Yeah, I didn't tell you that, right?
You may have.
So it's the first Wednesday of the month in November, and so that will be November 6th, I believe.
6.
You can find those programs online on the website and in our newsletter. And to sign up, you need to be on the main page. Scroll down, you have the button sign up, or you can also go talk to me at the end, and I will register you for the newsletter. Oh, also, just to clarify, the Brand Bag Lunch is free for everyone, and the third is free for members, and it's $5 suggested donation for non-members. Now, it's a pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Jonathan Bryant. Jonathan holds both a JD and a PhD degrees and has held prestigious academic positions, including at Emory University, the University of Baltimore, and Georgia Southern University. He is a leading scholar on American law, slavery, and Reconstruction, and his acclaimed books include How Curious a Land and Dark Places of the Earth, which was a finalist for the 2016 Los Angeles Times Book Prize in History. Today, Jonathan will be guiding us through the lasting impacts of the Civil War on Amelia Island. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan.
Well, good midday. I want to thank the museum for the opportunity to talk today. I want to thank Isabel in particular. She's been wonderful in organizing this. For my conversations with people, everybody hear me okay, right? I'm trying to use professor voice. For my conversations with people and years of conversation with students, I can say without question, Reconstruction's probably still the most misunderstood part of American history. So for this presentation, I've got two parts. First, some context as to how our understandings of Reconstruction have evolved, the emergence of a host of new resources and social change in the 20th century particularly changed our understandings, and this has continued into the 21st century. Second, I'm going to dip a little bit into the weeds, looking at sources that help us understand better the effects of Reconstruction on Amelia Island. So some caveats. I've written extensively on Reconstruction, but none of that research ever involved Amelia Island. What can I say? The political twists and turns of Reconstruction in Florida are particularly complicated, and I can't claim a full grasp of that story. I'm not sure anyone can. Working here as a docent, visitors are always interested in understanding more about the native people, more about the Spanish missions, more about the Civil War, and of course, more about pirates. I have yet to have anyone ask about Reconstruction. Even though it began here in March of 1862, one of the earliest experiences of Reconstruction in the United States, and it dominates Amelia Island Civil War experience. That said, I've just begun to dive into local records from the period, and I hope presenting a glimpse of some of those stories I found will open some windows for you into the past. As you'll see, with the new remarkable availability of online records, you can actually do some of your own research. The archives here at the museum as well are superb, and Rhonda, if you've never asked her for help, do. She's knowledgeable, she knows what she's doing, and she'll work until she gets you what you need. Recently, I challenged myself. I thought, well, can I write a brief historical piece about something of interest here in town using just the archives here at the museum? And I did. It'll appear soon, I presume, the case of the missing clock. So you can look forward to that. So we all know the story of Reconstruction. Rapacious Yankees, right? Traitorous scalawags and loyal but easily manipulated slaves. And I suspect most of us, considering the demographic in this room, learned it from that. Okay? Film and novels have a substantial impact in shaping public understanding of Reconstruction, none more than Gone with the Wind. Margaret Mitchell was a fine writer and a journalist, and in fact her novel reflects the story of Reconstruction that was told by leading historians of her era. And more about that in a moment. Thanks to the movie, the novel, many people believed that they understood what happened to Reconstruction. And you may or may not remember, but this is the essential turning point in both the novel and the movie. When they're suffering during Reconstruction, they don't have enough to eat, everybody is miserable, and this is when Scarlett decides she's going to take things into her own hand. She'll never go hungry again, right? You may remember this part of the story. Do we know the story? It's a wonderful novel, but, and I'll warn you, historians tell you this all the time. You ask a question, and what does a historian say? It's complicated, right? And unfortunately, it is always complicated because people are complicated. Those of you who prowl about the museum have probably seen a surprising plaque down near their Civil War uniforms. It explains that in May of 1865, Maurice Adolphe Mott was elected mayor of Fernandina. In this election, both white and black men voted for the first time probably in Florida history. I suspect, however, that everybody looks at that and doesn't even ask a question about who the heck was Mott and what the heck was, how did this happen? Adolphe Mott was born in the town of Carcassonne in southwest France. He was well educated, he had a gift for languages, and in 1850 he immigrated to the United States. Here he became a professor of modern languages at a college in Pennsylvania, and during the war he was sent by his friend, Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase, to Fernandina as clerk of the Direct Tax Commission of Florida. More about that in a moment. In June of 1865, the new mayor wrote now Chief Justice Salmon Chase, searching for an explanation of how to respond to President Andrew Johnson's May 29th amnesty proclamation. This executive order pardoned all Confederates except for leaders and some of the very wealthy with a simple oath. Those not automatically pardoned could ask the president himself for a pardon. And in fact, President Johnson issued 13,000 such pardons during his presidency. Once pardoned, people regained all their civil rights and all their property. So I'm sorry, I told you we were going to dig into some weeds. Here's the first of the weeds. Okay. Sir, he's writing to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, The proclamation of the President of State Reconstruction stands in the path of future history like a sphinx at the gate of Thebes, offering problems to be solved, enigmas and secrets to be derived. It is proclaimed that the states shall be provided with a republican form of government by the votes of loyal citizens. What form? Oligarchy, as in historical Rome and the medieval republics of Venice, Florence, and Genoa? Anarchy, as illustrated by the French Republic? Dictatorship, as Cromwell's or Bonaparte's? Is the freedman a citizen? Shall he vote? Will oath and testimony make Southern men loyal? Should Reconstruction be left in the hands of prejudiced Southern men? What form of government can be expected but the CSA pattern, which is oligarchical republics? Who will cut the Gordian knot? Sedet ama toga. That's Latin. It means arms must give way to civil authority. Ermine can do more than the sword. Law can do more than the sword. Actually, an incredibly perceptive letter, in my opinion. In fact, my first book literally was Law Doing More Than the Sword in Reconstruction. But I didn't know this existed until about a month ago. Wasn't it, Miriam? Maybe a month ago. Miriam, my wife, is here, and she has to listen to me. So, anyway. So what is this Sphinx? Chase never replied to this letter that I can find, though they continued to have a correspondence back and forth over the next decade. So early in the 20th century, a group of historians at Columbia University set out to try to answer this riddle. William A. Dunning, professor at Columbia, organized his graduate students to do histories of every state's experience in Reconstruction. Among them, you may have actually seen this ancient volume here in our library and also in other libraries, was William Watson Davis's Reconstruction in Florida, which was published in 1913. After the appearance between 1901 and 1915 of all of these volumes, others took these and used them to write different histories. Perhaps the most important was Claude Bowers, whose bestseller, The Tragic Era, that came out in 1929, was the historical basis that Margaret Mitchell used in writing Gone with the Wind. The last major work of this school was that of E. Merton Coulter, The South During Reconstruction, which came out in 1947. So we're talking a 50-year period in which these people's understanding of Reconstruction dominated. All argued that the ineptness of the freed people and their manipulation by pernicious carpetbaggers and scalawags created a catastrophe that we call Reconstruction. Interestingly, when I was digging in the archives here, I came across a talk that had been given by Bill Hare. Bill was the Callaway Professor of Southern History at Georgia College. I knew him back in the 1990s. He died, I thought of him as an old man. He died at 62. He was younger than me. What can you say? Anyway, his presentation that he gave was directly Dunning School. That people who were pond scum, that's, by the way, people from the north, I'm not making this up, came here and manipulated the black people in this community to enrich themselves and to impoverish the good southern people who lived here. This is, and I think that's Gone with the Wind, isn't it? That's the story that you're going to get here. But things began to change dramatically in the 1950s and the 1960s. First and most importantly, Roosevelt's New Deal had created a national archive so that federal documents could be located in one place, properly conserved and kept secure. By the 1940s, records of the Army, the Freedmen's Bureau, and other government organizations were no longer found by chance in attics and basements. I'm not making that up. but rather could be accessed at the archive in Washington, D.C. Second, in 1953, census materials more than 50 years old were transferred to the National Archive, where for the first time they were generally available to scholars. And third, in the 1950s and 60s, many universities began to collect newspapers, and using newly developed, inexpensive methods of microfilming, making those newspapers generally available. No longer did you have to go to some city or small town and hope that the newspaper there would allow you access to their morgue, if they even had one. Now you could just get the microfilm and look at these papers. These developments meant that a host of new materials were available. And as you can imagine, huge amounts of new data meant new perspectives. In tandem, in the 1950s and 60s, you saw the rise of the civil rights movement, the rise of a new women's movement, meaning that scholars began to take what black people and women did, said, and wrote seriously. I mean, before it's women, right? That's just, women are emotional. Don't worry about that. Now you begin to take it seriously and incorporate this into the corpus of your data. And so, right on time came Willie Lee Rose. Using the newly available federal records, newspapers, and census materials, she focused on the South Carolina islands around Port Royal, including Hilton Head, to follow what happened there following federal occupation in November of 1861. She called it the Port Royal Experiment. Oh, now you know where I stole my title, right? The Fernandina Experiment. The Port Royal Experiment. Freed people, she said, were not mere ciphers, unable to act or take care of themselves. Women, especially teachers from the north, brought to the islands by philanthropic organizations, had substantial influence upon events in the Sea Islands. The Army facilitated dramatic change, empowering freed people to form their own self-sufficient communities. And so in 1964, her book, Rehearsal for Reconstruction, basically opened the floodgates. And book after book after book followed, using these new materials and seeing what happened during Reconstruction in different and much more, I would argue, much more nuanced ways. Similarly, the Fernandina experiment began here in March of 1862, not a rehearsal for Reconstruction, but actual Reconstruction itself. The key to these new approaches to Reconstruction was the use of local history. Small places like Fernandina tell big stories. A lot of times I will have people say, why would you focus on this county or this town or this city? What is it that, I mean, that's not really doing history. You're just finding out what some people on a little island did. And the truth is, through finding out what the people on a little island did, you learn a lot about the bigger picture. Now, it's hard for us to imagine Florida as a sparsely populated frontier. I sat through 2 whole cycles of a traffic light today. Can you believe that? Florida population in 1860 was approximately 140,000 people. Did you realize Nassau County is almost that big now? Golly. I'm not sure what wildlife's going to do to us.
Put another traffic light in.
No, put another traffic light in, you got it. In Nassau County in 1860, there were about 1,900 white people, about 1,600 enslaved, and 60 free people. Almost all those free people lived in Fernandina. Key West was the largest city in Florida, about 2,800 people. Fernandina was the 7th largest city in the state, 1,400 people. And by 1870, Florida's population had grown to 180,000, which percentage-wise is a pretty substantial increase over a decade, but still, given there's 50,000 square miles in the state, that's not very many people. So, in early March 1862, the Union Navy and Army arrived. If you came to Holly Lane's presentation last month, I don't know if any of you were able to do that, you know a bit of that story. Soon, the federal troops settled in and they began to take stock of the situation here on Amelia. And on March 10th, the commanding general of the Union forces wrote to his superiors in Port Royal for advice. I'm sorry, I'm going to read at you again. I'm a historian, I can't help it. Okay? So this is the letter, March 10th, 1862. The Army departments here need little, if any, hired labor. And there's no private business carried on to afford them employment, talking about the people in Fernandina. The question, therefore, presents itself, what is to be done with these people who cannot be permitted to starve if they are ready to earn their subsistence and only ask employment to take care of themselves? Instructions in regard to the course to be pursued in this matter are respectfully requested. The contraband question, who knows what a contraband is?
That would have been the slaves.
Yeah. The contraband question also presents itself and will soon require to be decided by the military authority as regards their support. Some of these people were left behind, and others are presenting themselves daily, coming in from different directions. At St. Mary's, where I was today on a reconnaissance in company with Captain Dayton, commanding the naval forces here, there are a great many Negroes still remaining, some of whom have already followed us to Fernandina. And this is a week after he's gotten here. And already, General Horatio Wright, come on, you're supposed to come up. Oops. Oh well, it's not the next, it was just an animation. Never mind. Let's see. There we go. Now will it come up? Yeah, there we go. There's General Wright. Sorry, guys. General Wright's confronting that Sphinx. Does everybody follow what I'm saying? General Wright's confronting the Sphinx. And Fernandina becomes a beacon of freedom. It remains under Union control for the entirety of the Civil War. And other places in North Florida do not. So if you are enslaved in North Florida or Southeast Georgia, where do you want to get to? Fernandina. Absolutely right. This is looking at Fort Monroe in Virginia, where the idea of contraband started, but it's a political cartoon from the time, right? And presented in the normal racist manner of things in 1861. What can you say? But it's very, very instructive. And we have to remember, Mott's now confronting the Sphinx's riddle. Does anybody remember what happens to you if you don't answer the Sphinx correctly? She kills you and eats you. Okay? And so this is a very fraught situation. In fact, it becomes even more difficult after the so-called Second Confiscation Act of July 1862. In this act, it in essence says that if a person who's been enslaved is captured by the Army, runs to the safety of areas occupied by the Army, or lives in areas that are conquered by the Army, that person shall be forever free of their servitude and not again held as slaves. All right, when's the Emancipation Proclamation?
1863.
January 1, 1863. This is July 1862. Basically, Congress is freeing the slaves forever. So this then is an issue. What does that mean? What it does mean is that first off, politics here was not a central issue. Refugees, mostly formerly enslaved people who've run away, and people who have remained loyal to the Union, white and black, pour into Fernandina. Those who are not loyal to the Union have left. Those who are not loyal to the Union and can do so have taken their slaves with them. So you have a population here that's almost entirely new people. In December of 1864, the Army did a little census here, and the demographics had changed dramatically. In 1860, in that census, if you were the city of Fernandina, the population was about 60% white, 40% black, right? Well, now, in 1864, African Americans are 70% of the population. Even more interestingly, there were only 340 males in Fernandina, while there were 913 women and children. In other words, more than 70% women and children. How do you address this issue? How are these women and children going to take care of themselves or be taken care of? General Wright, even back in 1862, in a part of the letter I didn't put up there, he says, I don't have the supplies to feed these people. What am I supposed to do? And these people want to work, but there's no work for them to do here. Well, as you probably know, one of the solutions was for African American men to join the Army. Beginning in 1862, the first South Carolina Volunteers had been created, then the second South Carolina Volunteers. These were units in which the soldiers were almost all, well, they were essentially African American. Almost all were ex-slaves. These units became the 33rd and the 34th United States Colored Troops. That if you know anything about the Battle of Olustee in 1864, these troops play an essential role in protecting the defeated Union Army as they retreat. Very, very interesting. So that in part may account for the lack of some of the men. But nonetheless, these are mostly people who are in desperate situations. Meanwhile, let's make it worse. Congress, beginning in 1861, has to confront the issue of how do we pay for this war? Right? I mean, we're bringing in tens of thousands, ultimately hundreds of thousands, ultimately more than 1 million soldiers. How do you pay for these people? How do you pay for the equipment? How do you pay for the supplies? How do you pay for the losses in battle? How do you pay all of these things? Enormous sums of money are needed. Up to this point, most of the federal budget had come from tariffs on goods going in and out of our ports. Okay? Now a substantial number of those ports are gone. They're part of that Confederacy. So how are we going to deal with this financially? And so the Revenue Act of July 1861, and then there's several additional acts over time that refine these things. Let's see, there's new tariffs, so they basically up the tariffs, especially on things like sugar and stuff like that. And then everybody will go boo-hiss. There's an income tax the first time, 3%. Yeah, bring it on. And then there's a direct property tax. Now, one of the misrepresentations you get from that Dunning School, and that is portrayed very powerfully in Gone with the Wind, is that this property tax was only done on Southerners. No. Everybody in the United States had to pay this direct property tax. It was actually what we would call today at a very minor millage rate. But this was a way to get property owners to contribute even more to the war effort than they were just from the income tax or tariffs or a few other little things that they came up with. But there's a problem. So here on Fernandina, a large number of people had left their property to go serve the Confederacy. Joseph Finnegan, for example, becomes the commanding general of Northeast Florida. And he has a huge mansion here in the town. What do we do about that property? More importantly, it owes about $200 in this direct federal tax for that property. David Yulee, who has actually, oh my God, yeah, I'll say that a little later. Yulee is, he's problematic. But David Yulee's house is here. Many other houses are here. What's going to happen to them? So tax commissioners are sent by the federal government, among them Harrison Reed, who you may have heard of. He'll later become a governor of Florida. And these tax commissioners set about collecting the direct property tax that they can get to in Florida. Now remember, the Union really only holds Key West, St. Augustine, and Amelia Island. Occasionally, 4 times, they hold Jacksonville, but they don't manage to maintain their hold on it, right? And by the way, Jacksonville ends up destroyed as a result of changing hands so many times. They hold Cedar Key, they hold Pensacola, but most of Florida, they don't hold. What happens to those properties that owe this tax? They owe the tax. Well, what happens if you don't pay your property tax? Yeah, the tax authority sells it, right? So that's what these commissioners begin to do in 1863. So people now acquire title in these properties from tax sales in 1863. Then on top of that, you have a host of other elements that are going to confuse things in terms of property title. General Sherman, when he captures Savannah, issues his famous Special Order Number 15 of January 1865, in which he says all of the coastal islands from the mouth of the St. Johns River to Charleston are given to the freed people. Okay? Also, the rice lands inland along the rivers are given to the freed people. And what they are allowed to do is to go in and lay out a piece of property that they want to claim, no more than 40 acres. Yeah, 40 acres and a mule comes out of this idea. And then with that 40 acres, if they live on it and they farm it, they get to keep it until Congress shall regulate their title, quote unquote. Okay? Then in March of 1865, Congress passes a bill creating the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. This is what you probably have heard called the Freedmen's Bureau. And they are supposed to manage the lands that belong to former Confederates who've abandoned them. They've run away. And this happened commonly. When Union forces came near, the big landowners would gather up their enslaved people and move somewhere else to try to avoid losing their slaves. You have to remember, a huge amount of their capital was represented by the enslaved people that they owned. So you're trying to protect them. So what happens with these lands? The Bureau, the Freedmen's Bureau, is supposed to manage them and use them to help refugees and the newly freed people. And remember, there's more than 1 million refugees, white refugees, who've had their homes destroyed, etc., across the South. There are 4 million formerly enslaved people supposed to use this land as part of the process of helping them. And then you have President Johnson's proclamations in June and July, where he says basically, yeah, you know that General Wright guy who just a couple of months ago was trying to kill you or re-enslave you, he's pardoned now and he gets his property back. So if you're a freed person, or you are a white unionist, or you are a union soldier or officer, what? How can we possibly? And this is a man who's been killing my friends. How can that possibly be right? And then Congress comes up with another way to try to help people. They call it the Southern Homestead Act of 1866. And in essence, all the federally owned land in Florida is now open to homesteading up to 80 acres. Okay, thinking, yes, the freed people will now benefit from this. So suddenly there's all sorts of property titles and nobody knows who owns what. So here's good General Finnegan, and that's Joseph Finnegan's house. He had been one of the main contractors for building the Florida Railroad, had become quite wealthy out of it, built that 3-story mansion, and had done quite well, had run away, become a general in the Confederate Army, was one of the 2 commanders at that Battle of Olustee that I mentioned in 1864, etc. In 1863, Harrison Reed and the other 2 tax commissioners here, in their sales, had made a deal with a person you probably know about named Chloe Merrick. Chloe Merrick had come here in December of 1862 to be a teacher. In fact, if you can imagine, she and one other woman had 330 students. All right, literally trying to teach them from ABCs on. Okay, but she also, Chloe, toured around and visited where the families of her students, and found they were living in utter misery. Not only that, she found there were dozens and dozens of children, white and black, who were either orphaned or had been abandoned by their parents. So we need to do something to solve this. And what Reed and other tax commissioners do, the reason I keep focusing on Reed is in 1869 she's going to marry him. But what they do is they arrange for her to buy at the tax sale Finnegan's mansion, and then she turns it into an orphanage. Ultimately, there's some 60 children living in this orphanage in 1865. So, really, really interesting thing. But now he gets it back. What happens to all those orphans? What happens to other people's property that folks are living in? Somehow, a traitorous rebel who just a little while ago, again, I'm doing the perspective of the Unionist, right? Somehow this traitorous rebel is getting his property. He's going to suffer nothing from this war when we suffered so much as Unionists. Or David Yulee's house. Bought at a tax sale. It had become a boarding house. It also had been used for a while by General Wright as his headquarters. Okay. I have to talk about Yulee. I have to go a little further than I expected to. One thing most people don't know, and in fact I rarely mention this when I'm giving tours because I don't have time, and I still tend to go past the hour. Am I going on too long yet? David Yulee served 2 terms as senator, okay? And during his 2nd term was when the process of what will become secession began. So he is a sitting United States senator, and he is secretly corresponding with people here in Florida, helping them arm themselves in order to rise up against the government he's serving in. I mean, I don't know what else you call this, but treason. Exactly. And you can tell from my accent, I'm from Georgia, right? I would never taught to think of Confederates as treasonous or whatever, but that's what that is. I mean, he's a senator. He's taken an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. He's an oath breaker. So, you know, and you're going to give him his house back? Well, they order that this be done. The sheriff comes with a writ, tells the men living in the house, you got to move out. Yulee is supposed to live here again. And then they remove the guys from the house. A crowd gathers. Soon the crowd is picking up bricks and other things and tossing them at the house to add spice to it. At the same time, his wife has arrived on a boat down at the docks. She's going to come to the house and move into it. And a crowd gathers down there, and as you can imagine, she begins to feel really threatened. And I can imagine too, this is a crowd of people saying, go home, get out of here, you're not wanted. It's our house, whatever. And so, of course, Yulee, with all of his connections, is able to complain about this. But then it goes further. It goes further. The Florida Railroad had been given more than 600,000 acres across the state of Florida to help them in the process of building the railroad in the 1850s and early 1860s. Okay? A lot of this land was not just in Fernandina, but in Nassau County. That land had been confiscated by the Army as abandoned lands. And freed people had been allowed to build houses on it, to begin to farm it, to do other things with this land. Now, the corporation, by the way, the Florida Railroad Corporation was taken over by the Confederate government during the war. Okay, so now the Confederate government controls this corporation. But following the war, the question becomes, this is a corporation. Can it be pardoned? Oh, yeah. You shouldn't have let me see about the Sphinx. I'm raising too many questions, aren't I? Is a corporation something that can be pardoned? Can it recover its land? Yulee and a fellow named Edward Dickerson, you may be familiar with him. He was one of the main financiers from New York of the railroad, and was at this time. Yulee had a problem. They did say he was a traitor, and they imprisoned him at Fort Pulaski, as you probably know. And he sat there for 6 months. So somebody had to run that railroad. Dickerson came in and was president of the railroad. Both Yulee and Dickerson say, yes, of course the pardon applies to our corporation. I guess I'll let that pass without comment. One thing, it's very interesting. Again, it's a report, so you have to take it for what it is. But in the Freedmen's Bureau records, in 1868, the Freedmen's Bureau agent here writes several reports to his superiors about the Florida Railroad has hired regulators. Okay, regulators was a term for Confederate guerrillas, really, if you want to call them. Jesse James and his guys were regulators. Okay, these guys have turned into banditos. There's no other way to put it. And that bands of regulators have started going to lands owned by the Florida Railroad and burning the freed people out. Yeah. Now, that's just the statement of an ex-Army officer who is now the agent of the Freedmen's Bureau here. And he's going on testimony brought to him by freedmen from Nassau County about how they were being burned out. Oops, there we go. In fact, let me talk about the Freedmen's Bureau for a moment because it's often misunderstood. It was created in March of 1865, about the same time as the 13th Amendment, freeing all enslaved people in the United States, was added to the Constitution. And the idea was this would somehow smooth the transition from war to peace. And in particular, that you could come up with a way to help the freed people get their feet on the ground. You have to understand, literally at law, if you are an enslaved person and you've been freed, your former owner still owns the clothes on your back, still owns any tools you use to work the field. Still, you have nothing but freedom, as Frederick Douglass once famously said. Nothing but freedom. So what do you do with absolutely nothing? How are you, and worse, as Mott pointed out, and you're being released into a prejudiced society? So the Freedmen's Bureau is supposed to help the freed people. It's supposed to help these homeless refugees. It's supposed to bring about whatever's necessary for peace to succeed. In Florida, at first, the Freedmen's Bureau was very underfunded. And so Colonel Osborne, the first director of the Freedmen's Bureau here, had a few guys who were quote-unquote agents But what he had them do was travel around the state and visit different places and then write reports about what they found. So it wasn't until February of 1866 that you ended up with a resident Freedmen's Bureau agent here in Fernandina. And Thomas Levy is a very, very interesting fellow. I'll talk about him for a moment. Let's see. You see the other two guys, but I'll just... Levy had previously served in the famous Irish Brigade. You may or may not know about him. One of the storied units of the Union Army. He had been severely wounded at Fredericksburg and then had come back into what was called the Veterans Reserve Corps. What the Veterans Reserve Corps was, there were lots of Union soldiers and officers who had been severely wounded and were too injured to continue the active life of a soldier in the field. But they still have administrative abilities, right? They still have organizational abilities. And so the Veterans Reserve Corps continues to employ people like Captain Levy to work for them during and after the Civil War. In fact, Levy, for a while, he was sent to Fort Clinch, and he served as the provost marshal. In other words, the main law enforcement person at the post. Now, and this was very common, O. Howard, Oliver O. Howard, the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, was himself a wounded veteran. He'd lost an arm in combat during the war. He's now running the Freedmen's Bureau, and he begins to raid the Veterans Reserve Corps to get agents. Where are you going to find good agents? These guys will be the good agents, these veterans who have administrative ability. And so Levy is recruited, and he takes up, officially he's given the commission in January of '66, but he takes up his duties in February of '66. And his very first letter to Colonel Osborne, he says, no, please don't remove the soldiers at the fort because there is a band of guerrilla regulators along the St. Mary's River that have sworn as soon as the troops leave, they're going to burn Fernandina to the ground. Okay? And also please make sure that there are troops here, etc. And when you follow his letters, he's only the Freedmen's Bureau agent for about 6 months. But when you follow through his letters, it's just disaster after disaster that he deals with: starving refugees, smallpox epidemics, all sorts of low-level conflicts and larger violent conflicts. Raiders from Georgia. He even has to deal with drunk soldiers from Fort Clinch. You know, there's all sorts of things that he's having to struggle with, to deal with. And so he continually is reporting on these things, as are the other agents for the Bureau. One reason I focus on Letty here, and I'm about out of time, it's been about 45 minutes, so I'm almost done, is you may or may not know, after he left his employment as the Bureau agent here, he went back to New York and married Anne Reddy. Okay, he's Letty, she's Reddy, it's confusing. I didn't do that, did I? And then he brings Anne back to Fernandina. Like so many of the Union officers and men who'd been stationed here, he decided, what a great place to live. I can't imagine anybody thinking that nowadays. But what a great place to live. And so they came back in the 1870 census. He's listed as a justice of the peace here. So he's worked his way into the local community and is obviously respected enough to be justice of the peace. In early 1873, this is not a picture from 1873, but it's the best I could do. Again, our wonderful archive. In early 1873, he buys the Florida House Inn. Yes, the same Florida House Inn that you know today. And then, unfortunately, in late 1873, he dies. He's still a young man. His wife, in applying for a pension, Anne writes that he died of the long-term effects of his wounds. Okay. Apparently he'd been shot in the chest and in the hip, and only thing I can think is maybe over time somehow he developed gangrene, the thing doesn't heal properly, and then septicemia and dies. But that's just me theorizing. Anne continues to run the Florida House Inn. In fact, she and then her daughter run the inn all the way up to 1930, if you can imagine that. All from a guy who came here first as a Veterans Reserve Corps officer to be a provost marshal, and then who was the Freedmen's Bureau agent here. And now the world has changed once again. And I would argue that what it's done to historians is it's set the bar even higher. What's happened is so many of these materials, you remember me talking about the new materials that became available in the 1950s and 60s and how that changed perspectives and it changed the way we understood Reconstruction. It brought us into the weeds to be able to see what was happening locally. Well, now so many of those materials and more are available online. In fact, the letters that I showed you from Leedy and the letter from Mott, both are available online. You can go and find them. And so it's a remarkable opportunity that you have. There's so much just at the Smithsonian's institution's web pages in terms of records. And it's really up the expectation of scholars. In fact, I would argue in some ways it buries you in a blizzard of material now. It's somewhat overwhelming. So what I'm going to close with is if you are really interested, let me invite you. You can literally do it from the safety of your own home. You don't even have to come into the archive here. But I'm going to invite you to do your own research into the Reconstruction period. And when you start reading the letters in particular from these Freedmen's Bureau agents, it is jaw-dropping. It is jaw-dropping. The guys who were the boots on the ground, who are here actually experiencing what's going on, they were still at war. It was just a changed war. And ultimately, a lot of historians would argue a war in which the South finally triumphed. The result being Jim Crow, disfranchisement, and a struggle for 100 years for civil rights for African Americans. Thank you very much. I can answer any questions that I might know an answer to. Yes. Yes.
So it's often said that Fernandina is not the first, close to the first place in the country that had elected black folks. Black folks were elected after the war. Can you elaborate on that?
Okay, so apparently what happened was they decided the war is over, right? This is May of 1865. We've heard Lee surrendered in April. Even Kirby Smith has been chased down in Texas, and he's surrendered now in May. The war is over. Fernandina is no longer going to be under military control. Therefore, Fernandina needs to create a city government. And there were many places that were deciding the same thing at this time. They held a public meeting, and mostly white men came to this meeting, and they said, yeah, we'll elect a new government, the 40 of us here, or whatever it was. We'll elect a new government for the 1,500 people who are living in Fernandina. And suddenly freedmen showed up by the hundreds. And they said, no, we have to be included in this decision. So they held a vote, and the freedmen voted that they be allowed to vote. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Then they held the election, and they elected city councilmen, they elected a city marshal, and they elected a mayor. Most of these were men well known to the freedmen and who were thought well of by the freedmen. We're not, although, by the way, and it's true, Nassau County, unlike many counties in Florida, continued up until the end of the 1800s to elect local black officials. Because the county, we forget this, it was 50-50. Now you drive around Amelia Island, and except for seeing the Franklin Town sign and a cemetery, right? I'm not sure. And you see American Beach, but that's a creation in the 1930s. Were there ever any black folk on this island? Yeah. So, and they continued to vote all the way up until they were disfranchised here in Florida. So, does that help? Did I even get close to your question?
Let's say that first group, any black folks elected in that first election?
I think so, but I can't tell you for sure. I'm pretty sure the marshal was black that they elected. And I think a couple of the city councilmen, I think 8 were elected. I think 2 of them were black. But I'm not completely sure. Yes?
In the beginning, you had mentioned something about scalawags. I associate that term with the Northerners coming down and doing great damage to the South. Was there any evidence of their work here in Fernandina?
Well, so the 2 terms that were most commonly used were carpetbagger and scalawag. Okay? The carpetbaggers were generally people from the north, and the idea behind that was this was all he owned was what he had in a carpet bag was like a carry-on bag for an airplane. All he owned was in his carpet bag, and he came down here to try to profit off of us prostrate Southerners, right? So there's that. And then a scalawag is actually a native Southerner who has remained loyal to the Union. So, yeah. And this is, by the way, that's one of the impressions public has that's very, very incorrect. That somehow there was this solid South that all decided to become the Confederacy. No. It was very divided. And in fact, there's literally within the Confederacy, one of the things that weakens it during the war is there's ongoing guerrilla warfare between Unionists and secessionists. And this is particularly true in areas like North Georgia, North Alabama, Western North Carolina, places that just floated away. What we call Appalachia. Those people didn't own a lot of slaves, and they saw no real benefit to withdrawing from the Union, right? The areas that tended to support secession were, of course, generally those areas with the largest number of slaveholders. So there's enormous problems, particularly once in 1862, the Confederacy starts conscription. And by the way, I don't know if you know, no one will mind me suggesting this. Part of the Confederate conscription law included a 20 N-word rule, if you've ever heard that term before. And what that was is if you owned 20 or more enslaved people, then you weren't subject to conscription. G, can we make clear who it is we're going to draft and make go fight for us? And then G, is it any wonder in the last year of the war these guys desert in droves? No. I mean, common sense helps you get rid of these assumptions. So, yeah, so scalawags, that's the condemning term used for those who continue to support the Union even though they are native Southerners. And there are plenty of Unionists in Florida. You have to remember, Florida had only become a state in 1845. People here are all saying, what, 15 years ago we were so excited about being part of the United States and all the benefits that it would bring us, and now we're going to kick that in the face? So, there's a lot of conflict here within Florida. A lot of cattle stealing and killing other people's cattle and lovely stuff like that. It's like, wow, you read these letters, guys, it's like reading about the Wild West.
We were.
Yeah, we were. There you go. That's exactly right.
Cowboys were here in Florida. We had more cattle than any other state in the Union.
And these poor guys are like the marshals, although, I don't know. some of the marshals I remember watching on TV were really tough hombres. But, you know, they're supposed to go out and stop this stuff. In fact, Letty is writing his superior saying, you know, if I'm going to do my job, I need a horse. He has no resources. He doesn't even have a horse. I've got these poor people begging at my door. They're both elderly and unable to work. May I please have rations to feed them for 10 days? I mean, this is the type of stuff he's having to ask his superiors for. So he doesn't even have a horse to go chase these guys. And he asked several times for the fort to send soldiers. You know what they send? Artillery men who are on foot. Good luck chasing down mounted armed bands that are raiding through the county, right? It's just not going to work. Yeah, a great point. Other questions? Yes?
That picture of Yuli's house, was that off island?
No, it was here on the island. It's gone now. So is Finnegan's. Let's see, will it go back? No. Yeah. So,
Guard shack down in front of it.
yeah, that's a picture. Okay, there's Finnegan's house. If you know where the Board of Education offices are now, it was very near there. And then Yuli's house, my understanding, and somebody can correct me, there's somebody here who probably know. Yeah,
She knows. Well,
3rd Street and,
Alachua at Third.
At Third.
Between Third and Fourth.
yeah, and it's gone now too.
It's next to the Villa Palmas.
That's right.
The house, you know Villa Palmas? Okay, it was next to it. There's nothing on there now. It is an antique, yes, thank you.
And, you know, if I'm not trying to diss a hero, but you have to remember to be what David Yuli became, you have to be a rapacious and ruthless person to be that sort of businessman and to achieve the sort of success that he had as a businessman. And I think a lot of that gets revealed through Reconstruction. And that's, I mean, David Yuli, dang town name for him, right?
Look at his background though.
Yeah, well, you're right
He's the
about.
first Jewish senator in the history of the United States.
Yeah, even though by that time he'd said he was no longer a practicing
Yeah.
Jew, you're absolutely right. And he changed his name from Levy to Yuli.
But his parents, I'm sure his parents never told him anything about the persecution that they did.
Well, actually, Moses, his father, had actually come to Florida and gotten I'm sorry guys, but he'd gotten a land grant from the Spanish of thousands of acres down near where Sarasota is today. And the whole idea was it was going to be a refuge for Sephardic Jews, people of the Sephardic tradition who come here. Well, not very many people came. And actually, in 1818, I don't think I would have wanted to live in the mosquito-infested swamps there next to nothing. I mean, there's not even a Tampa at that time. So
Seminoles were the contested town.
they might have had something to say about it. You're correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
All the land that Julie had, that the railroad, that all this kind of free land, I guess, and you mentioned it, what happened? Who owned it now?
That's a very good question. So in 1867, having secured a claim to much of this land, the railroad then sold it to Dickerson and Yulee for 1 cent an acre. Not making this up. Okay. Again, how do you? I mean, he's incredibly wealthy. You have to remember that. And Dickerson is even wealthier. And this is back in the days before Rockefeller, Carnegie, etc., when your wealth comes through land. It's only later that industry is going to be the source of great wealth. So he plays the game very effectively. They sold it for something like 50 cents an acre, that's my recollection. Yes?
How they determine the taxes to tax? Was it done by square mileage, square feet?
It was done the same way it is today. There would be an estimate as to the value of the property. So Finnegan's mansion was estimated to be worth $5,500, and then the millage rate that they were applying, that let Chloe and Eric buy it for $25. In other words, these are very modest taxes because, yeah, especially in 1861, Congress had no idea how long this war would go on, how much this war would cost. Nobody had any idea. I don't know if you know, demographers have really looked at the materials now. Nobody had any idea that 800,000 or more people are going to die as a result of this war. And so that, you know, they create these very modest things. Actually, they yanked the income tax up. It's scary. They got it up to 8%. 1864, I know.
There's one more question
Yes.
there.
I just wanted to note, I noticed you referenced towards the end of your presentation, the Afro-American Museum. And we were there last month, and if you go to DC, that should be at the top of your list.
Oh,
It's phenomenal.
and some really good people have been involved in setting it up. It's not going to be the ideological assault that a lot of people tell me, oh, I'm not going to go there because, you know, it's just going to be an ideological assault on me. It's not that at all. It's a history museum.
It's amazing.
And it's very, very, just like the Native, have you been to the Native American Museum? Yeah, the same thing. It's a wonderful museum.
Where's that located?
Right there near the mall. In fact, it's in a very modernish looking building.
Yeah.
They're almost next to each other.
Yeah, they are almost next to each other. Yes.
Personal question to you, have you been to or have you heard of the Reconstruction Museum in Beaufort, South Carolina?
I have heard of it, but I have not been to it. Last time I was in Beaufort, it had not yet been created, but I would like to go there. You know, the National Park Service is trying to do some really interesting stuff around there because, again, in fact, National Park Service surveys reveal that one of the least known areas of American history among visitors is the Reconstruction period. And part of that is because it is so complex. And part of that is because you know, how would I put it? War is easy. Union troops, Confederate troops, right? But how many different groups are there struggling for a place during this Reconstruction thing? It suddenly gets very complicated.
Yeah, and then the Lost Cause movement really took off. That totally changed the narrative for everybody in the country.
And ultimately, these scholars at the Dunning School enshrine it. You know, how would I put it? You guys are probably old enough and experienced enough to say, uh-oh, this guy has a PhD, I better be careful about what he says, right? You know, there's a sense of authority that comes from being a professor. In fact, that was one of the things I enjoyed. So these guys spoke with authority in their way. Already things are changing from, I mean, I did the research the old way to me. I went to the National Archive and they bring out little bundles. And the bundles, by the way, if you've ever done this, it's really cool. They have that little red ribbon, the red tape. How do you get tied up in red tape? That little red ribbon, and there's a bow there, and I would sit there and I'd pull the bow and think, geez, somebody in 1867 tied this. You know, and then I'd open it up and look at letters that no one had seen since that time. And there's an enormous excitement to that. There's still large amounts of material that have not been digitized and maybe never will be. So there's still a call for doing that. But there's so much material online, this is beginning to transform things. And I probably, well, I'm retired. Other people can do that. Thank you very much.